Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Kerry Simmons, and welcome to Everyday Eerie, the podcast where the ordinary meets the extraordinary. Dive into the world of ghost stories, haunted objects, eerie places, and unsolved mysteries that will send shivers down your spine. Each week, we explore the tales that blur the line between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. So turn down the lights, settle in, and prepare to be spooked. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Salem witch trials, just in keeping of the witch theme. To delve into Salem's more haunted history, it's important to know a little bit of background information about what makes this town so famous, which I'm sure it's not going to be news to any of you listening. As we all know, Salem has become popular in history books for the mass paranoia that led to the accusation of about 200 people, most of them being women. Now, the Salem witch trials began in 17th century Massachusetts and what was then known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it took place between 1692 and 1693. But an important note is that in Europe, this paranoia surrounding witchcraft had been going on since the 1300s, all the way up to the Salem witch trials in the 1600s. So this was not the first time in history that something like this had happened. And it's funny because it did become one of the most famous events, but it was almost like the end of the kind of paranoia surrounding witches and people being witches and taking part in witchcraft and all that. Now, in medieval times, a lot of religions, including Christianity, believed that the devil could give people that they referred to as witches the power to harm them as individuals and as society in exchange for loyalty. Now, they believed this so strongly that in 1604, the Witchcraft Act was enacted, making the practice of witchcraft in any form a felony. At this time, a war had broken out in the American colonies between England and France called King William's War, which caused many people to seek refuge in this area of Massachusetts. Now, because of the massive influx of people, the agriculture and the resources were super strained, which caused a lot of rivalries between families. This, in addition to a smallpox epidemic and threats of attacks by nearby tribes, all added to the stress and the superstition by the Puritans, they became known as, that some evil was at play. They thought that for sure, with all of these horrible things going on around us, evil is the cause. Now, to add fuel to the fire, in January of 1692, the first ordained minister of Salem, named Samuel Parris, who no one really liked, noticed that his 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to have what they referred to as, quote, fits. During these fits, they supposedly would throw themselves onto the ground, make strange noises, and would contort their bodies in odd ways, causing a local doctor to diagnose these fits as supernatural in nature. Now, when another 12-year-old girl, Ann Putnam Jr., began to experience similar fits, there was a lot of pressure for the local magistrates to do something. After being questioned, the girls basically chose the fate of 3 of the local women in town. One of them was Tituba, a Caribbean woman who was enslaved by the Parris family, Sarah Good, who was a local homeless woman, and Sarah Osborne, who was an elderly woman with very little money. Now, when these women were brought before the magistrates, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne pled not guilty. However, Tituba reportedly stated, quote, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him," also reporting that in the visions that she had, she signed a book basically known as the Devil's Book, though it is later thought that this confession could have been coerced. This did lead, though, to a downward spiral with more and more accusations occurring each day. Questioning became more serious with paranoia growing daily, worsening when a very loyal member of the church, Martha Corey, was accused. The Puritans started to believe that if Martha Corey could be a witch, anyone could be. Another famous name associated with Salem is Bridget Bishop, a woman known for her promiscuity and tendency to gossip around town. She too was accused, seemingly because others were suspicious and disapproving of her lifestyle. Now, it seemed like everything someone didn't like about you gave them reason to believe that you were a witch. The conditions in the jails for the arrested were gruesome and dirty, with at least 5 of the accused dying while in jail. Now, without going into too much more detail on everyone accused to save time for some of the ghost stories that we have on Salem, it's important to remember that 19 people were hanged on what they called Gallows Hill. Giles Corey, Martha Corey's husband, was pressed to death by stones, but even though I was initially upset by this, once I found out that Giles accused his wife Martha, I felt like, maybe he got what was coming to him. Now, if all of this wasn't ridiculous enough to you, hear this one. One of the lesser-known victims accused of witchcraft was a girl named Dorothy Good. She was 4 years old. Yes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 quattro years old. Dorothy was the daughter of Sarah Good, again, who was also jailed for witchcraft early on, and she was accused by a woman named Ann Putnam, probably because Ann had it out for Sarah, who said that she came to her as an apparition and choked her. So, remember Ann Putnam Jr.? We had talked about earlier that she was one of the younger girls that started having these fits. Well, her mother, Ann Putnam, was the one who accused this little 4-year-old girl, saying that she came to her as an apparition and choked her. Sadly, Dorothy was so young that special shackles had to actually be created to fit her. She was jailed for 8 months until her father was able to come up with her bail money, but unfortunately, by that time, Dorothy had suffered from pretty severe psychological trauma, and she pretty much suffered the rest of her life for it, with some reports stating that she had gone clinically insane. Which, what else would you expect? Traumatizing to anyone, to say the least, but a 4-year-old, I don't know how you'd be able to come back from that after being imprisoned in dirty and gruesome jails and having special shackles made for you for 8 months. It's pretty understandable that she wouldn't really be able to come out of that. Now, looking back, some theorists suggest that the girls were either epileptic, which I find super hard to believe that every single one suddenly became epileptic and started experiencing hallucinations and the same type of these so-called fits. That just doesn't seem realistic to me. But they also suggested that the girls could have been bored, that they were experiencing child abuse, or were purely acting vindictive. Fun fact, too, at some point it was even theorized that they were suffering from a disease brought on by eating rye infected with a fungus. But again, I just find the fact that they were all acting in such a similar fashion to be suspicious. So, in my opinion, I would say that they were either truly possessed, experiencing hallucinations of some sort, who knows what they were dabbling in, or that they were bored, or again, purely acting vindictive. Those are the things that I'm going with. So based on the history, we have a little bit better of an understanding of why maybe Salem itself as a town has a haunted history. Now, the first haunting that I'm going to talk about will take place at the Witch House, which is one of the few structures that has direct ties to the witch trials, as the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, the man himself who had a direct hand in the execution of more than 19 people. Judge Corwin purchased this house in 1675, and it remained in the family until the 1800s. Now, it's made of black timber and is 2 stories tall. The house was claimed to have been marked by what is known now as the Corwin curse, due to the at least 8 premature deaths that took place amongst the Corwin family, with attributes to Giles Corey, who was stoned to death, and who supposedly cursed Corwin and Salem while undergoing this fate. Now, when reparations were made in the early 1700s by the town of Salem, who admitted that the witch trials were a huge mistake, Jonathan Corwin said absolutely nothing. He was too proud to admit that he and his fellow judges made significant mistakes, and some believe that it is this lack of repentance that became the root cause for his suffering. Corwin and his wife had 5 children together between the years 1684 and 1690, and they all died young. Those that made it a little bit longer than their siblings still died in very young adulthood. Corwin's eldest son died of a fever, and that same fever sickness claimed he and his wife's life as well. Now, in the years following, the witch house has been renovated and restored, and during this process, a few interesting things were found. So there were bones found beneath the house, though these bones were never identified as to whom they belonged. But they also found an old black shoe in the walls, which was said to be used as a way to ward off spirits and witchcraft. Another item of note was a, quote, poppet, which was a special doll that was said to be used for spell casting, with some sources saying that this poppet belonged to Bridget Bishop, the first to be condemned as a witch. So it makes you wonder, was Bridget actually practicing witchcraft? You wonder if of all the people condemned, if some of them actually were practicing witchcraft and we just don't know it. It's kind of one of those situations where, well, maybe someone amongst them was actually a witch. So you never know. This little poppet that was found, if that was an indication that maybe she was, or maybe she got it from someone else in town who was practicing witchcraft as a way of, putting a curse on somebody. I kind of think of it like a voodoo doll type thing. But anyway, some of the paranormal activity reported in this house by employees and visitors include feeling cold spots in certain areas of the house, which are drastically different in temperature, feelings of being touched, and hearing disembodied voices. Now, there have been a few reports of hearing the voice of a little girl, with some saying that this may be the voice of Dorothy, though since she did live into adulthood and there were so many young deaths in the witch house, I personally feel like it's probably more likely one of the Corwin children. But it does bring you up an interesting point too. If we could start talking about what makes ghosts, and you wonder if this traumatic experience kind of could bring the ghost back to the traumatic time in their life. So if it was Dorothy, even though she made it to adulthood, maybe that traumatic period, that traumatic experience almost in death had her stuck to that time frame in her life. Who knows? But again, because there were so many deaths of young children in the witch house, I personally think that, one of Corwin's children could be haunting it. Now, another Salem location with a haunted history is the old Burying Point Cemetery. And this cemetery is known as the second oldest in the country. It was established in 1637. Though many significant figures are said to be buried here, one of them is none other than John Hawthorne, one of the famous judges during the witch trials who seemed to really love sentencing people to death. It was like his thing. He was also super unapologetic for the trials. He, didn't want to admit at all that he was wrong. He was like, tough. Who cares? Big deal. But he is the great-great-grandfather of the famous writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, who, fun fact, again, was so incredibly ashamed of his ancestry that he added the W to his last name to seem as though they were not related. Nathaniel Hawthorne was also said to take midnight walks in the cemetery as his wife Sophia had migraines. And I guess this helped. I think we need to be looking into Sophia and start to figure out what was maybe going on in Sophia's mind, because migraines in cemeteries, I get a headache and my first thought is, ibuprofen, lay down, a dark room, not let me go for a walk in a cemetery, makes me feel great. But that's what the reports say. And because of this, many of the names used in Nathaniel Hawthorne's writings were actually taken from the gravestones in the cemetery. So I guess these midnight strolls at least led to some inspiration. So that's a positive. Now, many of the accused and persecuted from the witch trials were also buried here, so you can imagine the level of anger and unrest that might even exist here. Some of the haunted happenings in the cemetery include that people would step foot inside and just feel an overwhelming sensation of sadness and grief. Now, some skeptics are probably going to say, well, yeah, you're in a cemetery after all. Of course, you're going to be sad and there's grief. Blah, blah, blah. But there is a difference between feeling a somberness and, being sort of in awe by the old gravestones and the sadness, and then feeling overwhelmed by a grief that seems to just hit you like you were somehow personally part of it. Shadows, lights, orbs, mists have all been photographed here, as have actual apparitions. Again, on my Instagram page, you can find some of these photos. I'm going to be posting pictures of things that kind of correspond to the stories. So don't forget to check that out if you want to see some of these photos that people have captured. Now, one commonly seen apparition in the cemetery is the ghost of a woman who typically appears in the back corner of the cemetery, which for some reason really gives me the creeps. I hate the idea of something lurking in the back, in the corner, like kind of not wanting to be seen, just peering out every now and then, just getting kind of, caught on camera every now and then. But I just kind of imagine it like someone just peeking around a wall or something like that. And that really freaks me out. I don't like that. If you're gonna be seen, if you're gonna be showing yourself, I need you to just come out. I need you to just come out, be there, be in front of my face. None of this behind my back. None of this making the hair on the back of my neck stand up, being all like weird. I don't like that. But she is seen wearing a blue dress usually, and is usually carrying a picnic basket. Sometimes she's also seen with a little boy, and they're thought to be a mother and a son who died in a nearby fire. Now, this wouldn't be a haunted area without a lady in white. There is always a lady in white. We're going to hear about a lot of ladies in white. Any of you who have been on ghost tours around the country, at least I can speak from a couple places down, here in the United States. But in general, every time I go on a ghost tour, every time I look into haunted history, there's always a lady in white. Again, skeptics might say this makes the story less reliable because everyone's got a lady in white. But truly, though, if you think about it, ladies in white, ladies in black, ladies in gray, all right, the typical ones we hear of, they're wearing traditional colors of that time. Now, it was expensive to have clothing that was colored and dyed, so neutrals were more common. So to me, it makes sense that apparitions would be wearing more neutral colors more than anything else. But of course, there's a lady in white. But what's interesting about this lady in white is that she's seen more often hanging around the parking lot outside of the cemetery. And the reason why this is interesting is because the Irish immigrants to the area were buried on the outskirts of the cemetery during the times in which the Irish were discriminated against, making it more likely that she could be the ghost of one of these immigrants. Now, going back to Nathaniel Hawthorne, it brings us to our next location, which is the Turner Ingersoll Mansion, otherwise known as the House of Seven Gables, after Nathaniel Hawthorne's book of the same name, with this house as the setting, as it belonged to his own cousin, and again, his ancestors who played a role in the witch trials. Now, this one is a controversial haunting because some argue that it's not haunted at all, and nothing more than the creepy backdrop of a novel that occasionally hosts theatrical productions depicting the witch trials and history of that time. But some visitors would report the spirit of a man walking up and down the stairs, a phantom boy who plays in the attic, which used to function as a servant's quarters, and none other than Nathaniel Hawthorne's cousin, Susanna Ingersoll, who seems to like to peek out the windows down into the gardens and occasionally walk up and down the halls. Again, with the peeking, I gotta say, I don't like the peeking. I really don't like the peeking. But she's a peeker. She's a peeker. We got another peeker. But again, this is one of those things. Maybe someone who, if there's anyone listening who lives in this area, if you can shed more light on the hauntings described here and give us a little bit more information, that would be great, because it is controversial. So there were a lot of stories that were, for ghosts being in the area and ghosts, haunting this home. And then a lot of people saying, no, it's just a story. They're just stories because it's a creepy house. Nothing really happened there to make it haunted, yada yada. So we never know. But that is what I found to be the case with the house, is that there are some, spirits that have been seen walking up and down stairs, and those kinds of things. But some honorable mentions from the town of Salem also include the old Salem jail, Proctor's Ledge, which most historians agree was like the official hanging site during the witch trials, Old Town Hall, the Salem Inn, and a bookstore called Wicked Good Books. And again, when you have these old cities, especially ones that are tied to historical events like the witch trials, you wonder how much of that is actually true and how much of that is just because now Salem has gotten this name for itself, and it's kind of their shtick that it's haunted and it's creepy and it's witchy and all of that. And while it is, and while I do believe that an area that was, inhabited for so many years and experienced so much trauma and sadness, I definitely believe that there's hauntings. But you wonder how many of these locations are truly haunted, and like I said before, if there are any of the locations that are just kind of banking on the fact that they're sort of creepy and that they're in a location such as Salem that has this historical significance, if that's kind of what's making everyone say that it's haunted. So it would be interesting to see if there's anyone listening who has experiences of their own, but based on some of the stories and things, I truly think there are things going on there. But I'd be interested to see if anyone else has any other information. Now, again, don't forget to check out my Instagram page, because that's where I'll be posting spooky things and pictures and any other information that I have to kind of support some of these stories. If you want to see any of that stuff, it'll be on the Instagram page. And I'm also taking personal stories. So if anyone has any spooky story of their own that they would like to share for me to read on this podcast, obviously giving you credit, of course, you can email them to me at everydayeerie26@gmail.com. I'd love to hear them. I'd love to hear people's different experiences. And that can be anything from ghostly encounters, strange encounters, weird events, weird occurrences, miraculous encounters, positive things that are kind of supernatural, anything that you feel might be a little bit spooky, a little bit supernatural. I would love to hear it. I would love to read it. So go ahead and email me at that email, and I will also have that listed for you. And again, check out the Instagram page. But thank you for joining me again on this journey into the eerie and unexplained. Until next time, keep an eye out for the eerie in your everyday.